Matt Hurd, good to see you.
Hi, good to see you too, Doug.
This really surprised me because I haven't seen a result like this where people increasingly are not finding new podcasts through promo swaps, in other words, on other podcasts, but they're searching more. This is a pronounced difference. What does it look like?
It's certainly something to keep an eye on. Canadian Podcast Listener has been tracking this result for the past few years. As part of our discovery question, we ask how the most recent podcast a respondent discovered was discovered. And what we've seen pretty consistently over the past few years has been that on another podcast, so whether that's promo swaps or actually the host of the podcast just organically mentioning it, having another guest on their podcast from another podcast, those types of in-podcast promotions have been declining as a proportion of podcast discovery. And what we're seeing in its place, among other types of discovery, is that in-app discovery is going up. So what we're seeing, and I can share a screen here briefly that I touched on in a recent blog, is that from 2020 to 2025, we've seen in-app discovery of podcasts go from 16% to 25% of the proportion of most recent podcast discovery, while on-podcast discovery go from 22 down to 13. So not quite doubling and being cut in half respectively, but a pretty clear, consistent trend in one direction and the other for each of these discovery methods.
So when I translate that trend, what I see is promo swaps have gone from achieving about 20% result for podcast discovery. Promo swaps. Hey, you should listen to Matt Hurd. And Matt says on his podcast, hey, that Doug Downs guy, he's okay. You should listen to him. That has long been a staple strategy for podcasters and podcast agencies and podcast gurus and companies that make a big part of their living on promo swaps. It's shifting to people just on their phone. I feel like listening to something about peanut butter. Am I reading that right?
To an extent. I mean, this is a recall-based survey, and we're asking folks, monthly podcast listeners who come in, anyone who did discover a new podcast within the past 6 months. So this doesn't incorporate anybody who may not have discovered a podcast in the past 6 months. We ask them where they discovered it, and then we dig into sort of more details of that. So, for example, through the app I use to consume podcasts, we then follow that up with which app was it? And it's primarily YouTube and Spotify right now. Another big part of podcast discovery in the past that we've seen is word of mouth, which, as you might expect, telling your friends, your family about a podcast that you enjoy and you think that they would enjoy. And I think a lot of this comes down to a lot of the trend that we're seeing here comes down to the available options for podcast discovery as compared with what was available in the past. So, for example, 10 years ago, if you were consuming podcasts, and most podcast consumers were, in audio-only environments, you had a few options for promoting your podcast, either through sort of feed drop or for podcast-to-podcast promo swaps. Apart from being featured in the Apple or iTunes homepage or paid banners on some of the more independent podcast apps, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for in-app discovery. Whereas now, with more podcasts being consumed on platforms like Spotify and YouTube, both of which are very heavily invested in algorithmic recommendations, and in the case of YouTube, has that sidebar, particularly if you're watching on a desktop, that gives you all of your next potential listens or watches right there. These are options that didn't exist in the same format previously necessarily when considering podcast discovery. And even if the same number of podcasts are being consumed via the promo swaps and feed drops and such, the fact that more people are coming into the podcast tent on these new platforms, or at least new to podcast platforms, the discovery methods on those platforms are now making up a larger share of overall podcast discovery.
Okay, I'm going to put that in my own words. Let's say you have 100 listeners, or total listeners, millions, hundreds of millions per year. So you have 100 listeners. A big chunk of them would listen on Apple. A smaller chunk would listen on Spotify. Those same people are probably still using Apple. It's just the 100 new listeners, because the audience has probably doubled. Of the 100 new listeners, the same percentages are not going to Apple. They're using Spotify and they're using YouTube, whether that's just for discovery or YouTube as a listening/watching mechanism. What you're telling me is that Spotify and YouTube in particular seem to, at least for now, be earning a much larger percentage of new consumers to podcasts than Apple. And that's why there just as many Apple folks might be finding new podcasts through promo swaps. The number may not have changed, but the percentage has gotten smaller because there are twice as many people and they have different habits than the old folks.
Yes, I would say that's correct. We have seen over the past few years, particularly in Canada, some pretty impressive growth in podcast consumption overall from 2017 to 2025. The incidence of monthly podcast consumption has gone from 24 to 46%, so nearly doubling over that period.
Yeah.
If you consider that YouTube and Spotify are bringing in more new listeners in the sense that new consumers of podcasts are more likely to be using those platforms than using Apple, then that helps to say how even if Apple's share was staying the same, and it is, from what we can tell, declining slightly, their share is declining more dramatically than maybe their number of actual active users are. But because the pie is growing and Apple is not necessarily growing with it, the discovery that's taking place on those other platforms is taking up a larger share of that discovery pie as well. And something else to consider when it comes to discovery is that what we would consider power users of podcasts, so somebody who's either listening to or watching at least 5 hours of podcasts a week, they are more likely to discover a podcast on another podcast. So, your feed drops and feed swaps and promo swaps examples, also more likely to discover in app. So those power consumers, those power users of podcasts who do represent a larger share of impressions and listening time, they gravitate towards both of these discovery methods to a greater degree than the average podcast consumer who is not spending as much time in app and not spending as much time consuming podcasts and therefore discovers fewer podcasts through those two methods.
So that's a key point. So we're not saying promo swaps aren't still part of the strategy.
Certainly.
They are and should be, especially for those power consumers.
Right. And we have other questions in our the full version of the Canadian Podcast Listener Report. We've asked
subscription.
And
the
subscription report.
Yep.
We asked about feed drops, the proportion of podcast consumers who have been exposed to a feed drop to their own recollection. This is an episode of one podcast in the feed of another podcast.
I can think of a company that does feed drops as its primary focus. So go on.
And we then follow that up with, have you become a regular consumer of that podcast as a result of being exposed to that feed drop? And the results are very good. They're very strong. There's a high conversion rate for feed drops among those who have been exposed to them. So there is some upside there, certainly still, for these types of promotion methods. They're just now existing in a environment where there are more options competing for that discovery. And so, their share of that discovery pie may be impacted.
But don't leave SEO out of your strategy, because the algorithm is playing a big, and SEO playing a big role increasingly by sheer number.
Correct.
Not necessarily hours, but people.
Yeah, YouTube is a popular platform, podcasts aside. One thing to consider for on-platform discovery is that you can discover a podcast on YouTube when you were not necessarily looking to consume podcasts. You can stumble upon a podcast while you're doing your other YouTube related browsing. not so much the case
getting my
for
gaming tips. Yeah. Go on.
say Overcast or Apple Podcasts, where if you were in a podcast only environment, you were there because you were already in that podcast tent. It's unlikely you will discover a podcast on Overcast or Castbox if you have never listened to a podcast before, because you're not in that environment. So that right. YouTube discovery is part of what's growing podcasts, because the people on YouTube who may not be podcast consumers are discovering new podcasts that way and getting into the tent, which can lead to audio only consumption as well.
So good. So for more info, follow you. Have a look at the Canadian Podcast Listener Study, and follow Signal Hill Insights as well. For
Canadian Podcast Listener partnership between Signal Hill Insights and Ulster Media.
Thanks for your time, Matt.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Doug.